Right, and you use the NMRI studies, which is kind of a real-time way of looking at the brain.
Yeah.
And I might even be incorrectly, but one of the great summaries that you found, I think, in one of your psilocybin studies was actually that parts of the brain was shutting down.
Yeah.
And I think either David Nutt or Robin Carhart Harris said it was almost like an orchestra not having a conductor.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's the ego, what used to be called the ego, which is the part of the brain was shut down. And by shut down, that means deprived of glucose and oxygen, i.e. blood supply. The blood was reduced to that part of the brain. And that, funny enough, was my original interest in this field was in 1966, when I met a Dutch scientist. And one of his major, most fascinating hypotheses was about the ego mechanism being a conditioned reflex mechanism which controls the distribution of the blood in the brain, dependent on recognition of the word. And it's a top-down system which controls from the top, the cortex, down to the subcortical areas. And funny enough, our psilocybin research showed that. So that was very interesting, but now the terminology is different, which is the default mode network being a part of it, which is the part, it's very fascinating, these systems in the brain, these networks.
Right, and this is an idea you were thinking about 50 years ago.
Yes, without the knowledge of exactly how the networks work, but it was the knowledge of how the self controls the circulation of the blood to control behavior and what is happening in here. And through conditioning, we learn to control, to constrict, to direct, to censor experience, to channel down, to simplify. And so that's what the whole of kind of conditioning is doing, until one gets adult, when the skull seals. And then, on the whole, there's a tendency to become slightly more rigid, although not for everyone. But, and that's what we were studying, the ego mechanism, and describing it as the small mechanism of brain-blood volume, the distribution of blood and how it's controlled in the brain.
Right.
Because it needs to be controlled in order that we do all the clever things we do. If
Right.
we didn't.
And survive and those kind of things,
Yeah.
right? But when you introduce psilocybin, then those pathways get blocked down a bit, and you
Then the controlling, censoring hubs of this default mode network, which is a lot of hubs and centers where stimulation comes in and is sorted and censored and passed on. If the functions in those centers are reduced or turned off, the sense of ego disappears. So it becomes more primal consciousness, the consciousness of a baby, of an infant, when consciousness is more part of the whole, and the kind of sense of the ego has dissolved somewhat.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing, as you know, about our study was as people reported the loss of the ego, kind of going into the sense of eternity or whatever, one could observe parts of the brain, particularly the posterior cingulate cortex, being deprived of blood. And so it became much more anarchical, the brain. And all these different systems, networks, likewise, they slightly lost internal communication, but they gained communication with each other. So it became more chaotic, but more open. Mm. And that has kind of quite a lot of potential benefits. It's a benefit for psychotherapy, if you're trying to get to a trauma and move an inflexible pattern of behavior. Normally with therapy, the person can keep the repressions in place. So it's almost impossible, it's like water off a duck's back, it kind of goes. But with this kind of dissolving of the repressive network, it gets through, so you can reach the trauma and hopefully can wash it out. And it also propitiates creativity, because creativity in a sense is distant associations, connections between different parts of the brain which aren't normally connected. Suddenly you get an aha moment of oops,
right.
that. And so the loss of this censorship, which is part of what civilization has put on us. I mean, Freud is so good on the ego and the id. I mean, he was searching for this sort of knowledge kind of thing in his, particularly his early books on physiology, but never got there. And then I think Barth, who was the Dutch scientist, got a very new picture of how it might work with his picture of the ego and the control. And I think our study in psilocybin has given us an empirical look where one actually sees what Aldous Huxley expressed.